Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, thank you so much. Really excited to have the opportunity to share my research with you all. It's definitely an honor to be here. So today I'm mostly going to be talking about some work I'm doing as a postdoc at Oregon State University, developing some new methods to do nonlinear time series analysis in ecology. But I wanted to briefly start off by giving a little bit of an introduction of myself and some of the bigger picture research topics and questions I'm interested in. So like you heard in that introduction, I'm a quantitative ecologist, and I'm really interested in broad terms of thinking about trying to understand the influence of environmental risk and uncertainty, as well as dynamic ecosystem change on resource management and conservation outcomes. My research has used tools from theoretical ecology to characterize the influence of environmental variability and nonlinear ecosystem dynamics on conservation outcomes. And this has included a lot of work developing sort of genetic and evolutionary models, thinking about fish hatchery programs and dealing with sort of genetic risks associated with that. I also sort of try to link this sort of mathematical modeling and theoretical work to sort of applied decision making using tools from resource economics to try to understand how decision makers respond to different sources of risk and ecosystem dynamics. And in this area, I've been really interested in sort of value of information theory, trying to understand questions like what the economic value fisheries monitoring programs contribute to management. What I'm really going to be focusing on today is my work doing sort of statistics and machine learning. And the main idea here is to try to provide some sort of empirical basis for the sort of more theoretical modeling techniques I look at in the rest of my research, trying to quantify both different sources of uncertainty and nonlinear ecosystem dynamics from time series data. And I wanted to start off by acknowledging that the work I'm going to be presenting today is done with a bunch of different collaborators. I've been really fortunate to work with this large working group that we're calling the Scientific Machine Learning Working Group. And basically our goal is to try to leverage advances in machine learning to try to develop new and hopefully slightly improved time series modeling techniques in ecology. And this work is, in the broadest terms, motivated by the fact that ecosystems often exhibit really complex patterns of change over time. So a canonical example of this that people may recognize is sort of population cycles, like the sort of oscillating pattern of predator and prey population abundances in the snowshoe hare lynx example. They can also exhibit other forms of complex change over time, like ecological regime shifts. So this is a time series showing an ecosystem that was initially dominated by sort of perennial grassland species, but following a prolonged period of drought, the system made an apparently almost permanent change to a system, to communities that were dominated by a shrubland ecosystem. And fundamentally, all these sort of complex patterns of change over time are driven either by nonlinear interactions between species within the ecosystem. So in that first population cycles example, it's species interactions between predator and the prey species, or interactions between organisms and their environment. So if we want to develop models to think about these types of complex ecological change, we're going to need sort of a flexible modeling framework that's capable of recovering potentially unknown and nonlinear relationships from data. And we also need to be able to accommodate a lot of the inherent randomness in ecosystem dynamics, as well as uncertainty that's common in ecological data sets. Another feature that'd be really nice to have in a sort of time series modeling framework would be being able to combine the multiple sources of information we have about ecosystems and ecological change. And in particular, we're interested in trying to combine information from experimental mechanistic information from experimental studies in ecological theory with observations of long-term observations of ecosystem change, and essentially develop a framework that's able to synthesize both the sort of mechanistic view and the sort of pattern-oriented view in order to do tasks like inferring future dynamics and making forecasts. So to approach this problem, I've been working a lot with this tool called the universal differential equations. And essentially, these are conceptually relatively simple. The idea is to embed artificial neural networks within differential equation models to be able to learn unknown functions directly from data. So the example I like to use of this is with a sort of simple predator-prey model. So these are the Loca-Volterra equations with the prey abundance describing the change in the abundance of a prey species X and a predator species P. And this model, describes that sort of species interactions with this sort of linear interaction term that I highlighted there, purple. However, if we wanted, we could use this UD framework to relax that assumption of this sort of linear interaction term and replace that function, that interaction term, with a neural network to learn what the functional form of that species interaction term is directly from data. And there's nothing specifically magical about using neural networks to do this. They're essentially just a non-parametric function approximator. So we could use methods like spline regression, so people might be familiar with GANs, or like a Gaussian process to do this. But neural networks provide some useful computation, have some good computational advantages that make them sort of practically useful for this task. So there's efficient algorithms for actually training these models and fitting them using automatic differentiation. And neural networks also scale really nicely. The computation for training them scales really nicely in terms of the size of the data sets you're using, and also the complexity of the functions, so the number of input dimensions. And I think this UDE modeling framework has a lot of potential for being able to synthesize these multiple sources of information. So because we start with that differential equation modeling structure, we can encode mechanisms into the models using sort of model structure and parametric functions. And then mechanisms that we don't know ex ante or don't have a good sense of what the functional form may be, we can learn directly from data by training the models on time series data and learning those functions with neural networks. And then just to highlight how this might work, in this sort of that Loca-Volterra model example I started with, the sort of model structure has this sort of species interaction where basically conserves the flow of energy through the ecosystem, where consumed prey are being converted into predator biomass. But lots of other aspects of the species interaction that might be harder to get a handle on in terms of the mechanisms that change the shape of the species interaction term, things like handling times or other types of behavioral traits. We don't necessarily need to make assumptions about ex ante, and we can sort of train the network to learn the shape based on time series data. Despite the fact that I think these methods are potentially quite promising, when we started working with them, there were some significant limitations with the methods, because they initially been developed to work primarily in sort of physics and engineering type problems, where the data sets are pretty different than a lot of ecological time series data sets. And in particular, we found a lot of the methods that were previously in the literature to build and train these models really didn't perform well with common types of uncertainty that are pretty common in ecology. In particular, if there was any kind of stochasticity in the system's dynamics or unexplained variability due to unobserved like abiotic factors, these sort of the standard fitting routines really didn't work particularly well. And so, along with my co-authors, developed a sort of new method for building these models that we're calling state space universal differential equations. And the idea is relatively straightforward. We're using a state space statistical modeling framework, which is a type of time series modeling technique, to describe the uncertainty in a data set and sort of manage that component of the problem, and then embedding these universal differential equation models within that state space modeling framework to try to represent the sort of nonlinear dynamics within the ecosystem. And I'm guessing this is an audience that needs this primer, but essentially state space models describe a time series. So observations that are calling y of t here, how it's varying over time, as a combination of some latent underlying trend with some true unobserved state variable u, plus some degree of measurement error. And the way it sort of reconstructs this sort of unobserved trend and its dynamics is by combining two models, an observation or a data model that describes the relationships between the state variables and the data points. So a really simple example would be that the data is equal to the unobserved states plus some measurement error, and then a process model that describes how the system is changing over time. And in these examples, we're using basically a difference equation to describe that underlying process. So the state of the system today is a function of the state last time we observed the system, plus covariate factors, and then an error term. And we build the universal differential equation component into this framework, basically using this sort of process model, so modifying that function f of u of t minus 1. And to do that, we've used this sort of universal differential equation framework to define a continuous time model for the system's dynamics, based on a differential equation, little f of u, covariate factors, and model parameters. And then we've sort of shoehorned it into this discrete time state-space modeling framework, basically by just solving that differential equation between the time points where we observe the system. So not necessarily as theoretically well-motivated as you'd like, but training the models this way allows you to account for uncertainty, even though it's slightly ad hoc. And we found empirically it helps a lot fitting these models to more variable data sets. And the way we train these models is using basically a joint optimization procedure that simultaneously estimates the state variables U, any sort of known model parameters in the process model, and then it also simultaneously trains the neural network. And it does this by minimizing the sum of an observation loss term, which describes essentially the amount of measurement error predicted by the model, and minimizing the difference between the estimated states and then the process model's prediction. And yeah, so we train the model by minimizing the sum of these two terms and can add sort of an additional term to account for any kind of prior information you might have about known model parameters, and also add sort of penalty terms that reduce the complexity of the functions estimated by the sort of neural network component of the model. So with this sort of framework in hand, we wanted to basically know how well these state space UDE type models could recover nonlinear dynamics in practice from real ecological time series. And we wanted to understand, how the performance of these models depended on the goal of the analysis. So that could include forecasting future states of the ecosystem or inferring sort of nonlinear species interactions or other sort of types of dynamics within the data set. And then we also wanted to see how these models performed on data sets with different types of nonlinear dynamics. So this could be the sort of systems that have multiple equilibrium and an apparent regime change, as well as data with sort of oscillating or chaotic dynamics, as being the two main different cases. And then the third thing was we're developing this modeling framework largely because it allows us to incorporate that sort of mechanistic information into the model, rather than just learning and also learn from the data set. And so we wanted to see how incorporating mechanistic information influenced the model's performance on these different tasks. To look at this, we did a analysis where we looked at basically 4 case studies, 2 using simulated data where we knew the ground truth, so we could basically make kind of apples to apples comparisons with the fitted model and then the actual data generating process. And then 2 examples on empirical data sets to make sure things worked in practice and our simulated examples weren't, because you can generate simulated examples that aren't necessarily very realistic. And then each of these, the 2 simulated examples, one was a system that had sort of oscillating type dynamics, so it was data simulated from a food chain model. And then the second one was the system exhibited regime shifts. So we looked at a sort of kelp forest urchin barren model. And then the 2 things I'm going to talk about today are the empirical examples. And one, we looked at fisheries time series that had oscillating dynamics from sort of bioeconomic cycles as the fishery developed, which I'll get into when I get to that example. And then we also looked at time series data from a rangeland plant community where there was a regime shift. And yeah, I'll be focusing on these empirical data sets, but the results we found tended to be pretty consistent between the simulated examples and the empirical data sets. So I think these results are, it's fair to say that they're representative, at least of these four cases we looked at. So this first example I'm going to talk about leverages this really awesome data set from a long-term agricultural research site in New Mexico called the Jornada Experimental Range. And it's a really awesome data set because it goes all the way back to 1915 and it has annual observations of plant community composition going up to 1980. And there's been additional monitoring up until the present, although on a much wider, longer time horizon. So it's kind of useful for seeing how things turned out, not as useful for fitting the models. But we have this really awesome data set. And then the other thing about it is that it exhibits this regime shift. There was about a 10-year period of drought in the 1950s, and that caused this really long-term change in the ecosystem structure. And so that kind of dynamic is what we're trying to recover with these models in this example. And then just to give sort of a sense for what this looks like, on the left, there's a picture of what the ecosystem looks like when it's dominated by these perennial grass species. So there's a fairly homogeneous distribution of these plant biomass across the ecosystem. And then the shrub-dominated state, it has this much patchier environment where there's basically mixtures of bare ground and then these mostly one shrub species that sort of dominates the landscape. So we wanted to use this data set to think about how well, if we could develop universal differential equation models that could recover the sort of mechanism that creates this regime shift in the data set. We wanted to see if the models were effective at forecasting future changes in community composition. And then we looked at two models to test how incorporating biological mechanisms influence the model's performance. So the first model I developed tried to be a relatively flexible representation of the ecosystem's dynamics. So it's a differential equation model that basically has three terms. So it describes the change in each of the plant species densities that we have in our data set, xi, as a function of a term that represents the growth rate and recruitment of the population, the quantity of empty space, assuming there's sort of competition for space and finite, that's a limiting resource, and then a term for natural mortality. And the idea was we're going to use a neural network that takes the abundances of each plant species, precipitation, and temperature as the sort of three key variables, and see if we can recover that sort of regime shift type dynamic based just on approximating the sort of population growth as a nonlinear function of those three quantities. The other model, we tried to incorporate some of the important feedback mechanisms that are hypothesized to be important in the system. And so this is an arid environment. So precipitation and how precipitation interacts with soil conditions is extremely important for understanding what plant community composition is going to be like. However, this can generate feedback mechanisms because plant community composition in turn influences how rainfall interacts with the soil. So to put some meat on the bones there, I have a sketch which shows what a kind of cartoon of what the grass-dominated ecosystem state looks like. Essentially, the idea is there's fairly homogeneous distribution of biomass in the environment, and those plants essentially slow down rainfall as it comes into the ecosystem and prevents it from eroding quickly, and allows the rainfall to infiltrate the soil relatively quickly in a relatively homogeneous way. In contrast, in the sort of shrub-dominated state, there's patches of bare ground, and when the water hits there, it has a lot higher energy because it hasn't been slowed down by any plants, and it can erode and then concentrate in local areas. And so we tried to capture this in the UDE modeling framework by using the same high-level structure. So growth of each species is a function of growth and recruitment, availability of empty space, and natural mortality. But the growth term we assumed was a function of the soil, the availability of soil, water in each of these two different states. So the kind of homogeneous state, which favors grasses, and the heterogeneous state that favors the shrub-dominated ecosystem. And we modeled the density, the abundance, the amount of water available in those two different pools. So M for the homogeneous pool and H for the heterogeneously distributed soil moisture, using as a unknown function that we estimated with the neural network of the plant community composition X. And then we also include a term for evaporation, which is the denominator there. So we took each of these models and we trained them on this really awesome time series data set. So we looked at three species group, perennial grasses, shrubs, and then we lumped all other species, which tend to be at fairly low abundances throughout the time series. And then we also included precipitation and daily temperatures during the growing season as covariates. And so to test this question of if we can use these models to identify alternative community states, we generated bifurcation diagrams from the fitted model. So basically the idea here is we train these UDE models and we basically get an ordinary differential equation out the other end of the model fitting process. And we can do things like undersee how the equilibrium states of that differential equation change as a function of the important covariates, like in this case, precipitation. So this shows the equilibrium grass abundance on the y-axis and then precipitation on the x-axis. And so what we kind of expect to see if the models are recreating this regime change is a bifurcation diagram that looks something like this, where there is an equilibrium at high levels of precipitation that's dominated by those grass species, and then equilibrium at low levels of precipitation that's dominated by those shrub species. And if the system sort of tips, if precipitation declines and the system transitions to the shrub-dominated state, there's not necessarily a continuous path back as precipitation increases. And that would explain that long-term pattern of change in the data set. By contrast, you might have something like this, where there's a grass-dominated equilibrium and a shrub-dominated equilibrium, but there's sort of continuous change in between, or reversible change. And so, yeah, we looked at this on both models, and sort of surprisingly, we found that both of them were able to recover this, what we expect should be the correct bifurcation diagram. It has this tipping point at low levels of precipitation, and then the persistence of that shrub-dominated equilibrium. And I think it's particularly interesting that this sort of more non-parametric model is able to pick this up, because it's just figuring out that there might be this sort of regime shift type dynamics using this single sort of nonlinear function that we're approximating with the neural network term. So it seemed like these models are potentially doing a good job at inferring these nonlinear dynamics. However, we found they tended to have pretty low predictive skill, even compared to really simple null models. So we compared the two UD models, so the plant soil feedback model and then the simpler nonlinear growth model, to a null model that just predicted no change in ecosystem structure over time. And we found that our UD models did do a bit better, which kind of hoped they would. They were incorporating all these species interactions and important covariates like precipitation and temperature. But really, you don't get that much better performance than just predicting no change at all. And over a 5-year time horizon, that sort of more structured mechanistic model does quite a bit worse than the null model, which might indicate either some overfitting or things just being more complicated than they need to be. So at a high level, it seems like these UD models can learn nonlinear relationships from data with regime shifts, but they have more limited forecasting skill. And basically, the reason I think this is going on is that the regime shifts in the data set create enough variability in the observations, enough contrast to be able to estimate these nonlinear functions that are driving the ecosystem dynamics. But most of the time, the abundances of each species are near one of these two equilibrium states, and they're not changing a lot over time. And so there's sort of a limited usefulness of having this complex nonlinear model that can describe these two alternative ecosystem states for making short-term predictions, like over a 1- and 5-year time horizon. So yeah, so regime shift, potentially useful for making inferences, not so great for forecasting. And we basically got the same result in our experiments with simulated data where we knew what the underlying data generating process was. It's good at recovering that and not very helpful at forecasting. So the other example, we wanted to look at some time series that had cycling patterns, and I had the RAM legacy database on my computer for a different project, and it has some interesting time series in there that exhibit this sort of boom-bust type cycling dynamic. So this is showing time series data from chili pepper rockfish, which is a ground fish species down in California, and it's showing harvest in red and the stock's biomass in blue and how it's changing over time. And this is showing a pattern that's characteristic of a lot of fisheries time series, where there's initial period in the data set where harvest and fishing effort are increasing over time, and they're having a relatively limited impact on the stock biomass. So there's kind of a period of fishery development. That's followed by a period where harvest continues to increase even as the biomass of the population declines significantly, so a period of overexploitation. And then because the stock is sort of below a level where it's profitable to harvest and fishing effort declines. And then in this case, the government came in and changed how the fishery was managed significantly after the sort of boom-bust cycle had occurred. And so what we wanted to do with this data set was try to see if we could develop UD models that are able to recover this sort of boom-bust cycling pattern in the fisheries time series as it develops. We wanted to see how well models could forecast both changes in the abundance of the stock and harvest level. And then we wanted to see if including any kind of biological or economic mechanisms could improve how the models functioned. So to start off, we kind of did the same thing where we started with a simple model that just provides a really flexible, basically non-parametric representation of the system's dynamics. And so for this one, we modeled changes in the abundance of the population S and changes in harvest as just the full right-hand side of the model are these non-parametric neural networks recovering the dynamics directly from the data without any mechanisms. But we also we trained it on this sort of chili pepper rockfish data set. And we included an indicator variable to highlight basically this one large change when management started changing significantly in the 1990s. And we think that that would have an impact on the dynamics. The second model, we tried to incorporate a little bit more mechanistic information, and this is based on bioeconomic models, simple bioeconomic models of open access fisheries that predict this kind of oscillating pattern. So we started with basically a fully parametric model for the stock. We assumed logistic growth minus a term for harvest, which was fishing effort and fishing proportional to fishing effort E times the stock S. And then we had a second differential equation that described changes in fishing effort over time. And sort of bioeconomic theory would suggest that this should be the change in fishing effort should depend on how profitable it is to harvest the fishery. But because we don't have a lot of good cost data for this data set, we're going to infer this sort of feedback and all that sort of those incentives for investing in or not investing in the fishery using this neural network type framework. And again, trained it on this chili pepper rockfish time series and included an indicator variable for the significant change in management, because that's likely to change this responsiveness of fishing effort to stock. Because rather than it being economic incentives, it changed to doing what the government tells you. So to see if these differential equations can recover the oscillating type dynamics from the data, we basically simulated time series from each model and plotted them as a phase portrait. So this is showing the real data, and what we'd expect to see if we were recovering this sort of boom bust oscillating pattern would be this kind of cycling dynamics, where you start at high abundances of the stock and low levels of harvest, and then it cycles in towards some equilibrium state. And so we looked at how we ran this analysis for both the models, predicting based on the dynamics before the change in management in the 1990s. In both models, so the fully non-parametric one, and then the sort of one that's based on this bioeconomic model, predict very qualitatively similar oscillating patterns, although there are some quantitative differences in what's going on. Oh, doing it on time. And then we also looked at what they predicted after the change in management in the 1990s. And on the left-hand side, or the right hand, I guess for me, is the model that was just a fully non-parametric model. And it seemed to predict something that's pretty unrealistic, which is a limit cycle type behavior, where the harvest and the stock abundance kind of oscillate in sort of predator-prey type cycles. Whereas the more structured parametric model predicted that the system would converge on an equilibrium level of stock and harvest, actually pretty close to the maximum sustainable yield predicted by the logistic growth model we used. So it seems like potentially in this case, the model with more structure is doing a better job inferring the dynamics from this data. So having that additional model structure is being valuable in that sense. The next thing we did was we tried to test how well these models performed at forecasting using a leave future out cross-validation method. And spoiler alert, these did a bit better. So we also, instead of just comparing it to a null model, we also looked at some competitive alternatives. We looked at a multivariate autoregressive state space model, so Mars model. People are familiar with Eric Ward's work, and then other forms of nonlinear time series models called empirical dynamic models. And in addition to training it on the chili pepper rockfish time series, we looked at another population more or less in the same fishery or the same region called cow cod that exhibited similar qualitative dynamics, but there were some quantitative differences. So we wanted to see how that would impact the model's ability to make these sort of forecasts. And so we compared these sort of 5 models, 2 UDE models and the 2 sort of competitors, or 3 competitors, at forecasting on a 1 and a 5-year forecasting horizon using leave future out cross-validation. And then these are like the mean squared forecasting errors on the y-axis. And I've highlighted the sort of structured bioeconomic UDE model because it seemed to be the best forecaster across on the 1-year time horizon. And then it was one of the better performing models over the 5-year time horizon. It had the best forecast for the chili pepper rockfish time series. And it was slightly worse than the null model and the Mars model for the cow cod time series, but performed similarly. And notably in this case, incorporating the parametric functions in that model structure helped the forecasting a lot. So that sort of fully non-parametric universal differential equation model performed really poorly at the future out forecasting metric. particularly over the 5-year time horizon. And so I think the big takeaways here are that these universal differential equations can learn these nonlinear relationships from data with oscillating time series dynamics. And again, part of the reason for that is we have enough contrast in the data set. So this oscillating pattern creates enough variability to be able to estimate these nonlinear species interactions and functions. However, and the nonlinear relationship between stock and harvest creates a sort of relatively constant pattern of change. And so you actually need the nonlinear model to be able to make forecasts that are accurate. You can't just use a simple null model that predicts it'll stay near the equilibrium. You actually have to be able to predict how it's varying over time. So just briefly to revisit those sort of high-level questions I started out with. One, to understand how model structure, the goal, how these models performed based on the model structure, the goal of the analysis, and the types of nonlinear dynamics in the data set. And the first thing to highlight is that some of the tasks for inferring dynamics from data really require known functional forms for the unknown functions you're estimating to be biologically meaningful. So I didn't get into this super explicitly in any of the examples, but with that first sort of local Volterra predator-prey model, the neural network really represents that species interaction term, so the predation rate, and you need the rest of the model structure for it to have that interpretation. So the model structure can be really important for inference. And then in terms of adding physical constraints and other mechanisms, it can improve forecasting skill, but it seems to be really context dependent. And it likely depends on if you are actually picking the right mechanisms in your model to begin with. So it depends on how well the system's understood and how well those mechanisms can be modeled mathematically. The second thing I wanted to highlight is I think the performance of the model on different tasks really depends on the characteristics of the data sets that you're working with. So I've broken this up into 3 cases. You could argue there's more, but I think at least for what we've explored, this is sufficient. One would be basically a time series varying around a single trend or equilibrium. Second would be time series that has a regime shift and 2 or more alternative equilibrium states that it's varying around. And the third would be oscillating and or chaotic dynamics in the time series. And this first one, I don't think these models are probably going to be useful at all. There's not really necessarily enough contrast to estimate sort of nonlinear functions and interactions because you just don't have, the data aren't spanning enough of the state space to really basically be informative about the functional form of the dynamics. The sort of multiple stable states type time series have enough contrast to be able to estimate functions and learn from the data. But it's likely that they only help forecasting during this time of regime change. Otherwise, you don't really need the nonlinear model that can predict both equilibria. You really just need a model that's good at forecasting in the one you're in and maybe some sense of how likely it is there's a regime change. But usually those are pretty unpredictable. Like they're driven by stochastic factors and it's pretty hard to predict them in advance, even with the right model. And then the last piece is, it seems like the models did well at both forecasting and inference on these oscillating and chaotic time series because there's plenty of contrast in the data set due to the oscillations, and you really need the nonlinear model. There's consistent change that the nonlinear model can pick up on, and other techniques aren't necessarily able to. So yeah, there's a lot of next steps I'm really excited about with these methods. So there's a lot of incremental improvements. We're pretty early on in the research, and we've mostly been focusing on seeing these methods are useful at all. But I think now that we have them sort of up and going, there's a lot of small changes we'd like to make. So right now we're using a really simple observation model that assumes normally distributed measurement errors and a one-to-one relationship between the state variables and the observations. But the state space modeling framework provides a lot of other options. You could like try to accommodate new data types or other relationships between states and observations. We've also done basically no uncertainty quantification, which could be really, really important. There are ways of training these models, including the neural networks using Bayesian algorithms like Hamiltonian Monte Carlo, because you're essentially maximizing a likelihood function, and you can add a prior to it. So in principle, you should be able to do sort of Bayesian type methods. There are also other sort of variational methods for thinking about uncertainty in this context. And then the thing I'm actually the most interested in figuring out are better model comparison techniques. So we have different model structures based on what sort of parametric information is included. We've also, I didn't talk about this earlier on, but the sort of neural networks that are included in the model, we often have a regularization term that controls how wiggly they get, basically. And we've been selecting those parameters in the work I presented by using cross-validation techniques where you refit the model a bunch of times on the data set, leaving different components out. And that's very computationally expensive. So it'd be nice to have a model selection criterion like AIC or BIC, but coming up with the right penalty term is difficult because the number of parameters in the neural network doesn't actually correspond very well to the number of degrees of freedom. And so we need to think about how to do that. We're working on that problem, basically. There's also a lot of sort of big picture things I'd be really excited about doing. So like I said at the beginning, a lot of my research is really focused on this high level question of trying to understand how uncertainty and dynamic ecosystem change influences resource management outcomes. And so we're trying to think about ways of applying these tools, which are maybe useful for sort of making inferences in basic science to a more applied problem. Something that we started working on is using these models in a natural capital asset pricing framework. And these are basically bioeconomic models that try to quantify the economic value of a natural resource using a dynamic model of the system. And in particular, these models, this method requires an empirical model of the management strategy that's being applied to the system. So if it's harvesting in the fishery, the question isn't how valuable is this under the optimal harvest strategy, it's how valuable is this under the empirical observed harvest strategy. And I think we could potentially use this universal differential equation framework to try to learn that sort of harvest strategy. And what I'm calling the bioeconomic UDE model that I presented in that fisheries case study, I think provides a framework where we could start doing that, because it's essentially learning this relationship between fishing effort and the stock's biomass, which is that management strategy directly from data. Another next step I'm really interested in is thinking about making these models work with spatial data sets, because a lot of the important dynamics that are going on are not only observed over time, but they're also observed in spatial patterning. So in that regime shift in the grassland I was talking about earlier, the change in ecological regime was really driven by this change in spatial pattern formation. We're right from this homogeneous landscape to a heterogeneous landscape. And so there's lots of information in essentially the spatial component of the data set that we didn't look at, but you could potentially leverage. And one way I'm interested in doing this is building these sort of basically taking this universal differential equations framework and making them universal reaction diffusion equations. So you could have essentially build these neural network models into a spatially explicit model that has a diffusion term to describe the spatial dynamics. You can also have advection terms. And then all the sort of local nonlinear interactions could be modeled with either a neural network or one of these UDE models that uses a combination of processes. Yeah, and then to end, a little bit of self-promotion. If you're at all interested in working with any of these methods, should have my email, so you can definitely contact me. We've developed a package to fit these models in the Julia programming language that's available on GitHub and on the Julia registry. And a R package to do all this is in the works, but currently it's in Julia. So if that's too nerdy, I apologize. And then the other thing is, I only talked about 2 of the examples, and I probably waved my hands at a lot of things. So there is a manuscript for this that's in the review process, but we posted it on archive because that's what we chose to do. And so it's up there. It's the same title as the title for my talk if you want to go find it to get more data or more information about this. And I'd like to end by acknowledging NSF funding for this project through a cyber infrastructure grant, and then all my collaborators on this project, part of that through the scientific machine learning working group. And I think it's like 10-15 minutes for questions. So yeah.
Yes, we'll open up the floor for questions. Anybody has one?
Tell us a little bit about the simulation scenarios that you use for model fitting, and I'm particularly interested in the ratio of process to observation variance. I'm thinking about the empirical examples you use, which struck me as almost no process variance. Curve, it must have very little observation error in it. So anyway, if you could just tell a little bit about.
Yeah, so right now we're basically fixing the level of process variation like in advance. So we're just making some assumption about what the correct ratio is. That is something we could definitely estimate, but we're really focusing on trying to get these nonlinear dynamics and capturing that correctly to begin with. And then we're going to think about doing the uncertainty quantification piece. In this example, I think you're probably right. There's very little process noise. Partially, these data they're actually model output from a stock assessment. So the biomass time series has been smoothed. And the harvest data, obviously there's some observation noise, but it looks like that sort of oscillating bioeconomic model kind of captures that curve pretty well. So this one I think has pretty low process noise. And that's reflected in the way we parameterize the model. This data set, this data set has quite a bit of process noise in it. This is actually observation noise, these big variabilities. Basically, not every single location that they monitored was monitored every year. And so sometimes they would monitor a patch that had one of these big shrub bushes in it, and sometimes they would monitor a patch as empty ground. So some of that variability is observation noise, but particularly in that perennial grass time series, just precipitation and temperature really aren't describing a lot of the variability, particularly in the beginning of the time series. So in this one, we used a little bit more process noise to observation noise. And then the simulated examples, we had one where we looked at that where we really explicitly tested what happens to forecasting if we add more process noise versus more observation noise. And we found it's a little hard to make a direct comparison just because they might scale slightly differently. But we found that adding more process noise particularly makes it harder to recover the dynamics from those oscillating time series and breaks down that forecasting result. So I think part of the reason we got this nice result that these models work really well at forecasting in this example is because there's less process noise. So this was more process noise, basically less predictable inherent dynamics inherently. It might be these models wouldn't necessarily work as well.
So you said you prescribed those to those.
Yeah. So all these results are prescribed, and you can really only estimate, it's hard to estimate both, because if you let the observation noise be a free parameter, it'll often just go to basically zero, and the observation, like the estimated states, will just equal the observations. So we've also experimented with estimating the process noise and fixing the observation noise. But these ones we prescribed it. Yeah, which is, definitely not ideal. I think it'd be better to estimate it. I don't think it necessarily has a huge impact on the results in terms of being able to recover the sort of underlying dynamics. But if you want to do this, I think it would be better in terms of just having this be a rigorous framework that's doing both uncertainty quantification and estimating dynamics to estimate particularly the process noise.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that would estimate almost no observation because of that, how smooth that curve is, but a little bit of process variance.
Yeah.
Did you try to fit just a regular state space model to your shrub grass state?
We didn't. Yeah. And part of the reason for that was because there's kind of that regime shift type dynamics, like a linear state space model. I guess if it had autoregressive lags in it, maybe it could capture some of that. No, yeah, we didn't look at that. So that'd be a good thing to think about. Part of the reason was because the universal differential equation models we built weren't as good at forecasting. We didn't feel like we needed a really good model to compare them to at forecasting, because it would just be better. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see. And yeah, like you said, it'd be good to know what those were to see what our tests are doing. Yeah.
How did you recreate the vibration?
Yeah, so this is a little bit of just like the back end of the software, but basically the way we've written the package, you fit the model and there's lots of different functions there's lots of ways of analyzing it. And one of them is just asking it to return the right-hand side of the differential equation with the trained neural network. So you have, here, I'll just hop through so you'd have, this model trained, so you'd have the trained parameters for the neural network, the growth rate, carrying capacity, all that stuff. And so then you just have a differential equation model and you can do whatever analysis you want with it. And for that bifurcation diagram, we just basically set the right hand side equal to 0, solve for the zeros, and then you, as a function of precipitation. Does that make sense? So you get the differential equation out and then you can apply.
Yeah. I guess I'm picturing like a bigger,
Yeah.
like, is it pretty short to solve for the zeros in that?
Yeah, it's not so bad because the neural network has a lot of parameters in it, but it doesn't have a lot of outputs. So it's just outputting, in that case, a three-dimensional system of differential equations. And so you're solving for the zeros of a three-dimensional system of equations. And the functions that estimate that three-dimensional system of equations are really complicated because they have these neural networks with all these parameters. But the neural networks, you can evaluate them pretty quickly. So you just give them inputs, they spit out outputs, and then you can give that to a nonlinear solving algorithm. And it goes slower than if it was, a simple model. But yeah, the hard part about neural networks is training them. And they actually have some advantages training relative to some other methods. But evaluating them is fast. So you just get a function and then you can find the zeros of it. Yeah.
We've got another question online from Jim Thorson. I'm gonna try to, hopefully you can hear. Can you unmute? Jim, can you speak now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, I was curious kind of along those lines too. I always assumed these would really start crushing parametric models once you can train on a really large data set and then do kind of like retraining, kind of like they do with large language models that are retrained on smaller tasks. And I guess I was just, like you could do it on the whole RAM legacy database and then retrain on an individual stock. So I guess I was curious, like, if you had anything to say about how long it takes to train it and kind of what practical impediments there might be to doing kind of larger kind of multiple time series at once, kind of batch learning.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
So the question was practicalities about how long these take to train, and then also practicalities about doing something like a batch learning technique where you're training these on multiple time series. Jim, does that sound right?
Yep.
Practically, the way I kind of think about these is like the neural network's just a fancy function, a function approximation tool that's simple with a fancy name. So I think these are going to be a lot more like if you're just trying to train any kind of relatively simple time series model. It's just that they include neural networks as a way of representing non-parametric functions in a non-parametric way. So these are relatively simple. We only train them on one time series at a time, although we have ways of training them on multiple. I would say these models that I presented here today take 4 to 5 minutes to train on my laptop with like CPUs. So we're not using like leveraging the like GPU computation that's common with really large neural network models. I think, yeah, so you can train these on, we're working on ways of training these models on larger data sets to think about that sort of sharing information between populations. I would say if you want to do a really big, like train on a huge number of data sets, we've done some experimenting as part of this project with different types of recurrent neural network architectures, so things like long short-term memory models. And those are really good for that sort of training and retraining where you could, we've actually done this where we've given a LSTM, so a recurrent neural network, the entire RAM legacy database, and then get it to predict individual time series. And that actually works pretty well. Yeah, these models are trying to be more interpretable, right? The issue with doing that, just a big machine learning model is you don't have any ability to incorporate sort of any kind of structure into the model. So you have sort of a black box interpretability issue. But when you do have something like the RAM legacy database, that's super powerful because you can incorporate a huge amount of information, and they probably would do a bit better than a model that's trained on a single time series like these.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah.
And then we had another comment from Trevor saying another good example would be returns of pink salmon that oscillate between even and odd years, and where the relation between spawners and returns is not well known.
Yeah. I mean, that would definitely be something to look at. We haven't done anything with those like stock. You could use these in theory to get like a stock recruit relationship. I mean, those are hard to estimate, and so then fitting a sort of non-parametric thing might be even more difficult, but yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions?
I was curious why you don't just go to patch-based approximations for the spatial dynamics rather than go all the way down to diffusion terms. It's just a very minor modification to the structure you've already got.
Yeah. I think it just depends on a little bit on the types of dynamics you're trying to capture. We haven't really gotten into that spatial modeling as much. We have some folks working on the sort of patch-based model. So I think that's a good approach as well. For some of these more like continuous, like sometimes if you have a continuous spatial data set, I think so like I guess what I was imagining with these would be like sort of like remote sensing data where I have almost like an overhead picture of a same area every year for a long time, and I can see spatial pattern changes in spatial patterning. And I think this type of model, basically you'd have a huge number of patches to describe like each pixel. And so I think this continuous spatial model might be better in that context. And then, whereas if I had a different context where I had maybe a bunch of different plots where I was monitoring the abundance of the population, maybe in that context, it'd be better to do a patch type framework. So I think it might be a little data dependent. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, well, if there's no other questions, let's give another round of applause for Jack here.
Yeah, and thank you so much. I can't see everyone on Zoom, but I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and everyone who came in person. Yeah, I'm really jealous of you guys' building here at SAS. It's absolutely beautiful. Went on a little walk down on the lakeside. Last time I was here, that was like a police building. So.
Well, thank you everyone for coming to QuantSem today, and we hope to see you next week, where we will hear Dr. Jeff Dozer talk about advances in hierarchical spatial modeling for forest and wildlife management. So thank you, everybody.
Yes. I shared it.